Yeah, Michael, just tell us something about what you did after university and what you do now.
Yeah. So I guess at uni, I was doing using artificial intelligence and applying that to coastal imagery to try and extract parameters from waves and environmental processes, things like erosion and those sorts of processes. So yeah, I ended up actually trying to commercializing my research and do a little tech startup. Um, and then I learned pretty quickly the how competitive and nasty the entrepreneurial tech startup world can be. And so it didn't work out, but it's still good to give it a go. And then yeah, actually I've always done it, just in my spare time, things to do with apologetics and at church, and yeah, so now I'm working in this ministry at the moment, called Creation Ministries. So yeah, really enjoying sort of researching and doing a little bit of speaking here too. So really enjoying it.
And tell us a little bit about Creation Ministries and what it does.
Yeah, so it's a ministry that's I guess the way I see it, it's essentially just helping people trust trust the Bible, and particularly in Genesis. And that whole intersection is to do with science and faith. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it's, I mean, with the coastal background I've got, looking at things like the flood, and the flood being global, and what a global flood, how does that affect the whole world, and the history of it. And I guess the topic today is actually related to that, because it's the depending on how we interpret the genealogies, um, gives us different ideas of Earth history, um, from a biblical point of view, at least. So yeah, bit of intersection there too.
Fantastic, fantastic. And before we get started, so we've got a presentation with some slides in a minute, but just say something about your church background, Michael.
Yeah, so that um, well, the church I've just started a new church. I've got recently got a girlfriend, so going along to her church, which has been very nice. But I've been in the church for probably like, I mean, since I grew up Christian. But uh, yeah, I think I've been to quite a few denominations: Baptist and Open Brethren, I think it's called, or Community Church, and even Anglican a bit. Yeah, been to all sorts of churches, and love the people of God wherever they are. So yeah.
Right, fantastic. Um, sorry, just a quick message. Richard saying there's lots of echo going on. Is it better now, Richard? Nod, shake, no. Has anybody else got any sound problems? No. Okay. Well, we'll carry on as we are. um, hope it sorts itself out for Richard. So yes, Michael's got some slides to share. In fact, we're going to do a bit of a double act. So I'll talk a little bit as well. But let me bring up the slides, and Michael can start us off. And I encourage you to switch off your cameras. I think everyone's now muted. That should help. So do keep yourselves muted until we open for questions in a little while. If you switch off your camera as well, that might just help people to focus on the speaker. Just so you know, at the top of the Zoom window, you should find 9 little squares where you can click and select something like speaker view if you just want your screen to show whoever's making a noise at the time, which will hopefully be mostly Michael and sometimes me. So let me just share the screen. And I shall go to slideshow. And yeah, Michael, when you're ready, if you want to kick us off, and then we haven't practiced this, so let me know when you want me to say something, and I'll jump in. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah. Can I'll just let you know when to flick the
Oh yes, do
slide,
you want to
actually.
just tell me when to
That works.
advance? Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I guess the context. So that we're looking at Genesis chapter 5 and 11 in the Bible, which we've got two lists of people, and the ancestors of genealogies. And the idea is there's some interesting numbers in those lists. And yeah, I've been actually reading through, I guess this is just, I mean, Rich has looked at this too, but for my background, I've been trying to understand all the different views on it, because there's different views to, those that I have about interpreting the Bible, and I'm trying to think, well, why do people think these views? Why do they hold these different interpretations of Genesis 5 and 11, where the numbers may not be of real lifespans, or be symbolic, or use a number system based from the ancient Near East at the time? So yeah, hopefully we can explore all those things together, and I'll share my conclusions based on looking at all that, and Richard as well. So yeah, that's the idea. So we go next slide. Thanks. Yeah, so Genesis reports great ages. So if you haven't seen these passages, we've got Adam living to 130 years old, and then having a son, Seth. And of course, these people had other sons and daughters. We read that in the text that says that. That could have been before and after as well. We certainly know that for Adam, with Cain and Abel being born before. And then, yeah, lived a remaining 800 years, and that's a total of 930. So there's this pattern that goes through Genesis 5, and it's in Genesis 11 too, although it doesn't tend to have the total at the end. But you get some very long ages, close to 1,000 years. And then, yeah, it goes for all Genesis 5, you get these ages, apart from Enoch, who was taken to the Lord early. But yeah, very old ages. And then even Noah, and the age at which they, that one of their descendants is mentioned, so 187 or 130, is quite large, although I guess within range if you say relative to their total age. But then you've got Noah, who lives to about 500 years old, has the sons probably within a few years, 10 years of that 500 years, of the sons who are on the ark. So there's some unique things going on. Now, if we go to the next slide, so then we get to Genesis 11, and it continues from, we've got Noah to Shem, and then picking up from Shem and Arphaxad. And again, there'll be some names to pronounce. I'm pretty sure, I guess it's one of those things that no one can be absolutely sure how the names were pronounced in the original time, because of the way that language and things progress over time. But you'll just have to forgive me if my pronunciation isn't the one that you're used to. But yeah, we've got this sort of declining progression of ages and lifespans after the flood as well. So there's some interesting patterns here, but there's also some patterns to do with the numbers and the digits themselves. And so we're going to have a look at that. So we'll go to the next slide. And so I guess this sort of summarizes, Richard put this together, which I think is a really nice summary of some different views. There's, one, if you just read the Bible and go through it, I might think, oh, well, if that's what it says, then the ages are exactly true, or for example, accurate to 1 year. That's one view. And then another one, it could be that the ages are true approximations. And approximations can feel like a naughty word to use with respect to the Bible. But we actually see in, I think it's in Kings, there's dimensions of the sea, or it's like a big, that's what they call it, but it's like a bowl for the temple, which has circular dimensions. I think it's got the dimensions that are provided for the temple furnishings and things, is the diameter and the perimeter, I believe. And you can actually use those values and work out that, the Bible got pi wrong. But no, they rounded to those values. If they wanted to put pi in the Bible would be a bit longer, because it's an irrational number. So, so that, I think, is a reasonable to say that there are approximations in the Bible, and that's not an issue in terms of inerrancy of the Bible. But then some others say that, okay, maybe there's encodings of true ages. So this one's not a very held to idea, but if you just think about it a bit, you can say, oh, what if it's actually months rather than years? And I guess there are some problems there with the age at which they give birth to people. It would be before maturity. But then another popular idea is that the ages are or fabricated, or maybe a softer word for that is or symbolic, or it has a meaning other than what is what seems to be on first reading of the text. And a lot of scholars that I've been reading are pointing to this and saying that because of the digit analysis and other peculiarities with the numbers, and what they believe is some parallels to ancient Near Eastern number lists of similar people with flood story heroes, then it's more of a polemic against the other creation stories of the time. And the numbers have symbolic meaning to these people. So I'm going to explore some of those ideas today. Yeah, we'll go next slide. So these are the sorts of questions to ask. So if we just keep flicking through these. So if they're exactly true, well, one of the questions that comes up is why do the digits, the ending digits, have so many zeros and fives? We'll see that soon. If we go to the next one. If they're true approximations, well, we've got to wrestle with why do people live so long? Because it's very different to today. If they did live that long, there's some biological things we've got to think about. And then the next one, if there's some sort of, and this is probably 3 and 4, we'll mostly look at 4 today. What's a plausible scheme for them to be symbolic and not to actually mean what I think is, if you just read the text yourself, I think you'd agree that without further analysis, it seems like the text is saying that these are real people and they live this long. And so, but we should dive deeper and have a look at the culture at the time, see if there is a scheme to interpret it a different way. And then some other things to consider, Richard will bring this up, is when we start to dig into the analysis of the numbers, some things like Benford's law, and I'm going to look at the digits at the end, and then also the decline in ages. There's actually some patterns and that are kind of hard to write in if you're trying to make these numbers up. So we've got a lot to consider with these views. Yeah, so we'll go to the next slide, and I think this will be the time I'll hand over to Richard.
Great. So yeah, we thought we'd look at those questions in reverse order. So first of all, let's look. This is something that really struck me. I never saw a graph of the lifespans of those patriarchs until a few months ago when I was reading a book that Brendan gave me, incidentally. And here it is. Here's a scatter plot. I haven't labelled all of them, but the first one is Adam, of course, reaching 930. And then through Seth and Arphaxad and Canaan and so on. Here's Enoch down here, labelled, who only was taken to the, he was not, for the Lord took him when he was, I think it was 365. And then we go back up for Methuselah, the oldest of all, then Lamech, who reaches 777, and then it's Noah with 950. And up to that point, if you leave out Enoch, they sort of wobble around. Lamech is rather low, but they wobble around 900 and something. But then there's this quite remarkable decline through Shem, the son of Noah, who gets the most, through who the genealogy is traced, and so on. And this curve really struck me. And it turns out that you can fit a curve, a smooth curve, through the points. And I played around with this a bit. I saw some other people doing the same thing using regression statistical methods. So if we start from Noah, and the reason for doing this, the obvious reason for doing this is that the Great Flood seems to have been a very significant catastrophe in the history of the Earth and the human race, according to Genesis. So if we start from that point and take Noah as generation 0, we can fit a curve like this. Now, obviously, you could fit lots of curves, and one of the books I looked at fitted a slightly different kind of curve. But this one, I think, has the benefit that it's an exponential decay curve. And here's the equation for it. Now, basically, what's going on here is that so the exp bit here means e to the power of, if you remember your maths, e to the power of 14 minus the number of the generation. So as we go from Noah at 0 through 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, this means that we are becoming, this part is becoming negative, and we divide through by 4 as well. These numbers have all been fitted statistically, so they are to try and make the curve go as near as possible to the points. And the 84 at the beginning is easy to interpret because that's a kind of asymptote or a baseline. So 84 is where this curve is tending towards. And of course, that is a fairly plausible kind of good old age for somebody to reach throughout, indeed, modern times, and certainly a lot of, perhaps a lot of the Bible history. So I was struck that a curve like this, it does have 4 fitted numbers, 4 fitted parameters. So 84, 37, 14, and 4. None of those are numbers that you would have necessarily, could have been able to think of in advance. But by fitting 4 parameters to fit a curve, we can get a curve that goes quite smoothly through the data. And even leaving aside the particular shape of the curve, I think it was clear to see that there was a curve. And that it decays in a gradual way. And I think it's important to point out that as far as we know, nobody was plotting graphs until modern times. William Playfair of Edinburgh is said to be the first person to publish, he published an influential economic history of the nations of the world, in which he made various sorts of graphs, bar plots and pie plots. But certainly, I haven't been able to find any ancient history of drawing graphs. So it's in our own time that we're making graphs like this. And so it would be, we can't pretend that somebody in ancient times was trying to find plausible figures that would fit a curve like that. So I think it does raise interesting questions for people who hold that the ages are in some sense symbolic. The fact that I'm struggling to think of a way that people would have come up with this trend if they were thinking of symbolic ages doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't a scheme, but it does intuitively seem implausible that someone would come up with numbers that fit a curve like this. So that was my bit. Oh yes, I'll just carry on through this. Michael's put this slide together, which just shows helpfully how Genesis 5 describes the ages. So if I'll just do this one, Michael, and it leads on to the next bit about Benford's law, if that's okay. So each person in Genesis 5 is described having been given birth to by their father, their ancestor. We're told how many years they lived, and then the age, that's the age when they begot their first son, or the son who is going to be traced through the genealogy. And then we're told how many more years they lived until they died. And then we're also told the sum of those 2 numbers. So 3 different numbers are given for each of the 9 people who are given in the Genesis 5 genealogy. For Noah, we also have the same information from around Genesis 9. But in a minute, we'll come to Genesis 11, where we're still given the same information, but it doesn't actually add them up for us in the text. So here's another example. Kenan gives birth to Mahalalel and reaches 910 years old, and then he died. Now, these are interesting because if we look at all these numbers, so here's a table of each key figure in the genealogy, and up to Lamech, that's Genesis chapter 5, and we're told those 3 things: the age X at which they had their descendant, the number of years they lived after that, and then the total when they died. And for the names after that, of course, you can easily add up the X and the Y yourself. So using these numbers, fascinating thing is, if we look at the leading digits of these, it will come in a minute to the trailing digits. You notice quite a lot of 0s and 5s, but whether or not the numbers might have been rounded probably shouldn't affect the leading digit at all. And it turns out, I don't know what you would think, if you took a set of ages or a set of large numbers that were counting something, and you were to just take the leading digit of each one, like these numbers in red, how many would you expect to get of each different digit? Would you expect to get, obviously you're never going to get a 0 at the beginning, but would you expect to get the same number of 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and so on? Well, a lot of people might think that, but actually it turns out that there's sound reasoning why you expect to get more ones than anything else, followed by twos and threes, and nines should be the fewest. And this is described by something called Benford's law. Again, something that I'm pretty confident wasn't known about when Genesis was being compiled. I'm not sure. I think it's a classic case where it wasn't actually Benford who first recorded it, but it's a 19th century writer, I think, who's the first that did note down what this law was. Basically, the law arises. So the grey bars describe Benford's law here. So as I say, the most ones, about 30%. Then the next most twos you should expect about sort of 18%, and then threes, and it slowly decays, and you should expect to get the fewest nines at about, 9% or so. And for those who are interested, this arises if you assume that numbers are being drawn uniformly from a kind of logarithmic scale. So on the right, I've got a logarithmic scale where we've got one big gap, then two, smaller gap, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 10. And then if we skip to stepping in tens, we've got another big gap before 20. And if you were to scatter randomly people or dots along this line, as you can see, quite a lot of them would land in a space where one was the leading digit. The tens or the hundreds all have one as their leading digit, and progressively fewer would land with a later number being their leading digit. So that's basically where Benford's law comes from. This graph, put together by Walter Marcus in a paper that we'll mention at the end, shows in the black bars what you actually get from this table. And I think it goes down a bit further because we can actually get some more ages beyond Genesis 11 as well. So, well, you can see for yourself, the black bars are not obviously exactly the same as the grey bars. In fact, there's not quite enough ones and twos for sure, and there are rather too many eights and nines for Benford's law. But nevertheless, it is broadly that sort of shape. It's certainly not a uniform distribution, which is what some people might have guessed you would get. So I'm not saying that this proves anything, but it is suggestive, I think, that these numbers might be actual counts of something, like how many years people lived or how many years before they had their first child and so on. I guess the extra surplus of eights and nines kind of reflects the fact that suspiciously nobody reaches 1,000. And it's almost, we might speculate, it's almost as if there's a sort of ceiling before 1,000. Or for some reason, people were not reaching 1,000 plus, and which could have inflated the number of ones instead of the eights and nines, because we've got lots of 800s and 900s in this table. So that's the second piece. Two pieces of interesting evidence so far, right? One is the decay of the ages when we count by generations. And the second one is the leading digits follow approximately what we might expect from natural measurements or ages. Michael, do you want to take over again for the next bit?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks for that. So the next thing is you can go to the next animation. Is the ending digits, and this is where it gets strange. So we've got 13 of 30 ending digits in Genesis 5. I'm going to look at Genesis 5. We'll go back to 11 as soon, but it's not as strong as a pattern in Genesis 11. So 5 is the one that most people point to when they're trying to argue a case for, well, it's a very valid observation, but then trying to use that to explain something else. 13 of the 30 digits end in 0. There's something going on there. If we go to the next one, 21 of 30 end in 0 or 5, or in other words, 21 of the 30 numbers are divisible by 5. That's an interesting thing. And then the next one, none of the numbers have first column digits or ending digits that are 1, 3, 4, 6, or 8. So only half of the digits available are used as the ending digits. You can see the green highlight ones, the ones that are used. So we've got 0, 5, 2, 7, and 9. So yeah, these things are quite odd, peculiar. They're not what you would expect with just normal. I actually did have a look at some 19 generations from now of British royals, French royals, and I found Japanese royals as well. And I thought, okay, I'll just find some sort of null hypothesis to go, okay, what do normal genealogies look like? and they don't have this sort of pattern. So something's different. So if I just go to the next slide, I did some probability calculations. Now you can just, some people have said, okay, we've got, so for example, for the highlighted green, we've got 30 numbers and it's 50% or 0.5 the probability of the of only getting half of the digits, so 0.5 to the power of 30, and they get 1 in 1 billion or so as the chance. There's actually a bit of an issue with that calculation because you've got a dependency here. X plus Y is the last column. And so if you factor that in, it's that simple calculation is not factoring in the dependency. So I actually did a computer simulation with Python to just sort of brute force these things with the dependency, and I got these values here. So regardless, even though my values were a little more probable than what some of the scholars have been estimating, but I mean, that's just the nature of academia. You start with your ballpark and people refine it as you go along. It's still very unlikely, very unlikely. So the 21 of 30 was the one I found the most unlikely, 1 in 4.3 million chance. So I think these numbers are, when we looked at those possibilities at the start of what the text could mean, if they're exact values, it's always possible, but it's, I think these numbers suggest that there's something else going on. So let's explore what that could be. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through what a lot of scholars have been pointing to, and by comparing with the cultures around at the time, the ancient Near East, and some numbers in there, tablets and things that they've got, see if there's any similarities and ways we can actually interpret Genesis by using that. And so here we've got 3 different sources for the Sumerian king list. And you'll see there's some names here. Finishes with Ziusudra, which I think is actually it's actually a flood hero, so in their story. So they've got a roughly similar amount of people with very long numbers for this is actually describing the reigns of kings rather than specifically ancestors and generations, but it's very similar. And then it finishes with a flood story hero, something a bit like Noah. So the equivalent in, so I think there's a few slightly different languages in that same area, but they tell the same sort of stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, and you, in that story, you get, I think it's Utnapishtim, which is the flood story hero. So there's some similarities here, and you've got very large numbers. There's a lot of inconsistency between these 3 sources. So you've got the 2 tablets, the WB, and then Berossus was I believe it's a historian a bit further on. You can ask me about it later. I do have it in my notes, but they're just not, they're a different. I'll just keep going for now, but I can dig out the details for you. But you can see that the ages are wildly different. 67,200 years, 28,800 years, 36,000 years for the first row. But what is consistent is that you have this decomposition into 60 squared multiplied by a number, and a few of them 60 squared multiplied by a number, like the 2 Ubatutu, 60 squared times 5 plus 60 times 10. But there's this base 60 system that's consistent across all different sources. And even the totals, you get 60 to the power of 3 for some of them. And if we just flip to the next animation, there's the scholars have seen that there's this base 60 decomposition or number system used. So they've got SARS, NERS, and SOSs. And so the idea is, well, if there's that happening, and when we read about the history in the Bible, Abraham came from the land of these people, and then they came back to this land, into the promised land, with these people and this culture around them. So the culture's in and around the time, and we have to understand that. But yeah, let's go to the next slide and see how people have been using this to try and, just find a different interpretation of Genesis 5 with these numbers. You might be going, okay, we've got 60 months going on here. What's that? Well, 60 months is pretty much 5 years. And so if you just use base 60 as years, when you get to, say, X for Mahalalel, 65, and it doesn't fit. And a lot of the numbers don't fit. You've got 60, and then you're going to have to add a residual number as well. But if you do 60 months, which is 5 years, 5 years multiplied. Remember, most of the numbers are divisible by 5. So this is where it comes from. So you can decompose the numbers by 60 months times a number. And most of these numbers you can get. With the exceptions, all you got to do is just plus 7 years and you'll get them. Plus 7 years to something that ends in 5 gets you up to a residual of 2 in the ones column. Plus 7 when you got a 0 is you get the 7. So there's the 2s and the 7s covered. And then the 9 can be covered if you have a multiple of 7. So plus 2 times 7. And again, we've got the dependency x plus y. But there's I'll show you the sources at the end. My research, I've been particularly responding to the work of Lloyd Bailey. I found that on Michael Heiser's website, where he's the late Michael Heiser. He pointed to Bailey's work and was saying, "Oh, this is the way we should understand it." But a lot of this is actually based on Carol Hill's work. So she's published on this. But yeah, we've got this decomposition, and if we just flick to the next animation, go back one, just the little, yeah, there we go. Can symbolic meaning be attributed to all these variants? Because the idea of, again, these decompositions aren't in the text. The text just says the numbers. And the idea is, well, if there's a base 60 system, well, then can it mean something that isn't the literal ages? And so appealing to, if there's a plus 7, then that means there's extra spiritual significance added to this person. And then you've got a few, I've highlighted with different colors, the different types of decompositions with 60 months. There's a lot of different things going on here. And if we hold the view that the base 60 decomposition means that there's symbolic meaning or encoded meaning, well, there's a lot of different things that we need to attribute symbolic meaning to. And based on the text itself, we should actually see the plus 7s, if that is adding extra holiness or extra spiritual significance to people. Why don't we see it with Enoch, who is the holy man who was taken up to God early? And instead we get it for people like Lamech, and sometimes the plus 7 is only for the Y, the remaining years. Sometimes it's only for X, the time the child was born. Sometimes it's for both. So for me, I think there's a lot of questions we have to ask about this method of interpretation, because we need to be able to explain a lot from it when there's a lot of variation here. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to unpack the plausible schemes idea a bit more. So we go, we'll flick down. So Carol Hill's proposal, I've summarized it this way: a multiple of 5 and a multiple of 7 added together to symbolically show spiritual significance. We've got to be a little bit careful here as well, because all numbers above 23 can be created this way. If you look up for a Beaniest coin problem, it's a way you can calculate that 23 is the case for these two multiples. But for example, 24 is 2 times 5 plus 2 times 7. And so all the numbers in the Genesis 5 list are greater than 23. All of them can be reconstructed, decomposed into a multiple of 5, 60 months, plus a multiple of 7. And so, again, the 7, most of them is just plus 1 multiple of 7. One of them is a multiple of 2. But I think we're starting to lose explanatory power if we're using this method. Even though it's a model that you can fit the model if you want, does the model have much explanatory power? To push it to the extreme, I'll give you this example. Let's say that we say, okay, all the numbers in Genesis 5 are divisible by 1. And 1 represents monotheism. It's a holy number. And therefore, the numbers in the Genesis 5 list can't possibly be literal ages because they all represent monotheism. Now, that's silly. And this is a more extreme version than what I'm showing here. But I think you get the idea that the reason we can't use that is because it's got no explanatory power, because all numbers are divisible by 1. So that's one issue I have here. With go to the next 2 bits. Yep. 5 years is 60 months. I think it's clever to kind of have that, but it's an unusual order of magnitude. Imagine saying I'm looking forward to my lunch break. It's only 190 minutes away and 1 hour, instead of saying it's 4 hours and 10 minutes till my lunch break or the end of the day. I had a look through the Old Testament doesn't use this order. I mean, if it did, then I think I would be looking for symbolic meaning or spiritual, something different to what it does say. But I don't see this order in the Old Testament, and neither in the ancient Near East Sumerian king list. So again, when with numbers, you'll see it in the Bible. They'll use months and then days for the residual. So we usually to make up a large number, we use the highest order of magnitude unit to express the largest amount of that number. And then what's residual, we use a lower order of magnitude unit, hours and then minutes. And to use it the other way around, months as a multiple, 60 months, and then add 7 years is very strange, I think. I don't think that's in the text. And then the other one is the Sumerian king list. And the idea is that's the original sort of source, and then it's a Genesis 5 or the Genesis entirely, 1 to 11, I guess, is a polemic against the ancient Near Eastern creation stories. And in that way, Genesis is in a way a secondary, or even if it is inspired by God from that view, that it's still derivative from in response to the ancient Near Eastern stories. But if we flick down to the next bit there, one thing that's interesting is you look at the variation in the text sources in the Sumerian king list. We have some variation in Genesis 5 across the different sources, but it's very small, and the variation actually has consistencies in it, which helps us, realize that one of them is the progenitor or closer to the progenitor and the other isn't. So we've got this is the variation in the ages or years of reign for the Sumerian king list. Wildly varies. And then you've got missing values. And if we go to the next one, for Genesis 5, it's very consistent. And there is some inconsistency. The Septuagint, so we've got Masoretic text, Septuagint, Samaritan Pentateuch. As you get to Genesis 11, you get a fairly consistent, like plus 100 years for Septuagint, but it's a consistent variation. And so it's fairly easy to study and look at and go, okay, maybe the Masoretic was the original, or the Septuagint was the original, and one of them did a systematic change. Whereas in the other sources of the Sumerian king list, you can't find some systematic change. So yeah, I lean towards the Masoretic text, but there are others who prefer the Septuagint. But yeah, anyway, we'll move forward. So, to have all to, I guess, from my perspective, I struggle to hold to the view that they're symbolic numbers because of comparison with the ancient Near East. But the question I've got to then ask myself was, well, then if they are biological ages, then why are there so many zeros and fives? We need to still consider this. So if we flick through, here's the next slide. Yep. We've got the table here. And what I've done is I've highlighted in orange all the values that don't end in 0 or 5. They're not divisible by 5. And there's a little bit of a pattern there. I mean, it's not super clear, but as you go down in time, if we assume that's what's going on, then you get higher frequency of values that aren't ending in 0 or 5. And so if I just flick to the next quote in the animation, yep. So actually, just flick one more time, just so we've got the yep, that'll do. So yeah, Hardy and Carter. I've been following a lot of Carter's research while also engaging with other scholars. I think this is a reasonable idea, that there's a 5-year rounding convention from Adam to Mahalalel, 2 to 3 year rounding convention this is just rough, from Jared to Shem, and a 1 year rounding after that. And so in essence, the timekeeping, date-keeping technology develops over time. And within that, you've got some outliers. And so for Seth's Y value, very early on, we've got a precise value that's not rounded to 0 or 5. There's a few different ideas for this, but which this is a bit speculative, but I think it works with just human nature. These are human beings. It could well be that Enosh, who would have, witnessed his father die, was quite an analytical character, and he'd already been ahead of his time with timekeeping methods. So he knew exactly how old, with his historical records and when his father died. And then if you look at someone like Mahalalel and the row before, it's all ending in zero. Might have been a bit more of a less analytical character personality, and he just rounded them all to 10. And so the rounding idea, which could also be ratcheting as well. So rounding, you get to a certain age, you go, oh look, it's somewhere within plus or minus 5 years. So I'm just going to call it this. Or the ratcheting idea is, oh, this is a lot of years to keep track of, so I'm just going to celebrate my birthday every 5 years. And then if I don't get to the next fifth year, I'll just say, well, that was my age there. I didn't celebrate my birthday until the next 5 years. That's ratcheting. So either of these, I think, is quite plausible and makes sense that the zeros and fives everywhere. So if we flick down to the next slide, we're pretty close to finishing here. The next question is, okay, well, if we accept that to explain the digits and the numbers there, well, then we need to look at why are the ages so high? And this is a very valid question. We clearly don't live to near 1,000 years today. So if we flick through, and one more, another one. I think there's some fairly reasonable explanations actually to do with genetics. And so Rob Carter has done a lot of work on this idea of patriarchal drive. And what we saw in the numbers is that Noah's actually got this standout figure of having the sons who are on the ark around about 500 years old, which is very old compared to the other patriarchs in the age, even though they're very old too when they have their the next person in line. 500 relatively is much older. And genetically, that means in Noah's reproductive system, there's going to be a lot more mutations, corruptions in the genetics being passed on. And so I think this is the idea of patriarchal drive. If you look that up, and Rob Carter's name, you'll find articles on it. I think it's actually fits well with the exponential decay curve that Richard presented earlier. So the data actually suggests that this is actually something that could fit from something that we've got an idea of biologically in the way that genetics works. The other thing, I think this is probably less the case. It used to be an idea that was pushed by a lot of people with things like the canopy theory in creation circles, which has been largely rejected now. But you can't deny that if there was a global flood, then some plant species, for sure, that we see in the fossil record, gone extinct, and they could have been very nutritious. The weather, the climate, which is driven by ocean currents and temperatures, if there was a global flood, then they would have been different, probably different continental shapes before. So even though it's the same world that we're on, there's a very different, if you hold that view, I think it's consistent with that view to expect that there's going to be some changes to lifespans as well. But I think the genetic factor would be the primary one going on. So we go to the next slide. Just to summarize, so we've got this graph shows it well. I think you've got the ages of people up to the flood, and then you see these ages start to decrease. And that fits in with that exponential decay curve that Richard brought in at the start. So if we flick to the next slide.
Michael, can I just jump
in? You go for it.
Yeah, I just thought this is really interesting because it's another thing that probably surely wasn't done in ancient times, although of course it's not very difficult, but to line up the ages like this. And it's been pointed out to me before that when you add them up, Methuselah dies in the year of the flood. So that 969 takes him exactly, well, give or take a year to when the flood happens. Lamech, I checked, I think comes out to die 4 years before the flood. But what we don't have is any problematic Genesis 5 patriarchs living through the flood without being on the ark, for example. You might think that if somebody had made up the ages to have symbolic significance, then you might get that sort of problem, which we don't. On the other hand, I mean, it was pointed out to me by a friend the other day who's more skeptical about these ages that Noah is still alive when Abraham is born. I don't think there's a problem with that, but some people find that surprising. I mean, Shem is still alive when Isaac is born, I think, if you look down there. So it is quite fascinating to try lining up these ages and see what they imply. Anyway, I'll move on. Back to you, Michael.
Yeah. Just a quick one on that one. I think the Septuagint does actually have in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Those sources do have a little bit of discrepancy with the date of the flood and Methuselah's age overlapping. But I think that actually points to the Masoretic text being the original source, which most people who hold to the views that I do would go. The Masoretic text is the one that is and if most of the Old Testament translated uses the Masoretic text. Septuagint's useful too, but there are some clear things in the Septuagint where it seems like there's some or translation bias across it, even though it was quoted by a lot of the New Testament authors. So if you've got questions about that, we can go through that too. But I think that when you look at the Masoretic text, it does line up exactly with the flood, which is quite a good sign. So if we go to the next slide, weighing the evidence. So flick through a few of these. So I think based on the evidence that the rounding, ratcheting idea makes the most sense of the numbers, but also holds to the plain reading of the text. There's not just a table that's given to us. We've just looked at it as a table today, but there's Hebrew words in between the numbers which say actually comprehend it for us. And so if there's comprehension to the numbers, then we have to hold that up fairly high with a lot of weight. And if there's something to overturn the comprehension of the text, there needs to be a really strong amount of evidence in those numbers to do so. And so that's why I very much lean towards the rounding, ratcheting idea, which I think makes sense of the digits. We've got some ideas and models about genetic decay, pre-flood environment, post-flood environment for the high ages and the steady decay curves. And then if we flick through a few more, we don't need to come up with a scheme. There may be spiritual, symbolic meaning to some of these numbers too, but I think that it doesn't have to be either. It doesn't have to be at one or this. You can have true ages and also spiritual significance to some of the ages too, knowing that God determines, the time that we live to and die. And so, in a sense, God can fudge the numbers. It doesn't have to be someone else who's done that. He's got control over how long we live. And then we've got Benford's law. When we factor in the rounding, that doesn't affect the leading digits. So when Benford's law, looking at these numbers seem natural, I think they're natural and they've been rounded. And I think that fits well. So flick through the next bit. Again, it's be interesting to discuss because I'm sure there's some different views here. But when I've looked at this and studied and looked at both sides, I think true approximations is the best way to handle the numbers that we see in Genesis 5 and 11. Cool. So if we'll flick just a real quick one. If you're interested in a lot of what I've done is actually a lot of the research I've been looking at. Rob Carter from the same ministry I work with, he's in the US. He's done a lot of research on this, and he's actually got a book that just came out on all the genealogies in the Bible, and he does have focus on this particular area. A lot of the stuff I've presented too. He's a geneticist, so he's got a lot of background in this too. He actually looks at population genetics and I think it's mitochondrial stuff and other. It's not my area, but he looks at that as well. A few links there if you want to look at that. And I'm probably going to publish. I've got about 8,000 words of paper on this written already, which still has a bit of work to do. So I don't know how long it's going to take me to publish the stuff I've been doing, but eventually it'll probably be in the Journal of Creation if you're interested. If we flick to the next slide, though, it's important, that we read both views, and I want to make sure you've got these links so you can look at the other views as well. So Bailey, that's primarily what I've been responding to in my research. It's on late Michael Heiser's website. There's a link to the essay that he's written. And then Carol Hill, which I think a lot of that work was based off. Carol Hill was sort of the first one to look at this, I think. There's a paper there. So, take a screenshot of this, read up both, see what you think. And then the other two are probably closer to my view. So Walter Macau, not quite sure how to pronounce, sorry. That's with a Benford's law analysis that Richard looked into. And then some of the things to do with, what was first? Was the Genesis story first? Or was ancient Near Eastern stories first? is dealt with in this paper at the bottom. So yeah, anyway, there's some sources. Yeah, I think that's all for presentation. Yeah, keen to hear what people think and
Thanks.
discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And yeah, so yes, do feel free now, everyone, to switch on cameras and let's have some discussion. Like Michael said, there are obviously different views on this, and some people, some of us have very strong views on one of the positions. So it will be interesting to have a civil discussion if people want to put. I mean, there's lots of other arguments, aren't there, that could be made. Roy Clauser was sharing with me something he's written on this topic, taking a different view, and some of the ideas of the base 60. So yeah, anyone like to raise a comment or ask a question? Peter, yes.
Well, were the numbers in the early parts of the Bible to the base 10? Because 60, isn't it? 360 degrees in the circle, or rounded of 360 for a prophetic year sometimes. But suppose 10. I mean, wasn't it the Indians who discovered the naught with the cumbersome Roman numbers, and that's it. So, and tens do in ordinary numbers. It's just a question from my ignorance in this area.
Do you know anything about this, Michael? It did occur to me as well that base 10 is not universal across cultures, and yet it does seem to be that you need base 10 to make these this rounding and these numbers look plausible. Have you looked into that at all?
I have read some papers on it. My knowledge on it isn't super fresh, but I can.
I've just joined.
Elaine, just you can hear you.
But I can't hear anything.
Go on, Michael.
Oh, okay. But yeah, on that one. So yeah, I haven't looked at it. I don't think I've. Again, I've got recollections from papers I've been reading through of people dealing with that. Certainly the calendar keeping for at least for Levitical things and things like that is Israelites were fairly strict on doing because they had fairly strict laws on. But in terms of what number base system they use, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, I think that, I mean, the numbers are the base 60 system. Even if it was used, I don't think there's enough in to go for 60 months and then add residuals of years. I find quite problematic. But yeah, no, it's something to factor in as well.
Maybe there's somebody in the audience who knows a bit more about the Hebrew counting system, because you'll be realizing neither Michael or I is a Hebrew scholar. But I mean, it does occur to me that you can have a base 10 system without having a place value system. So you can count in 10. It's obviously very natural to count in tens because of the number of fingers we have. And you can certainly give priority to numbers which are multiples of 10. And then 10 tens would be also a significant number to use, even if you don't represent it with 100 or anything like that. Or because I think that Hebrew probably certainly Greek used the first letters of the alphabet to represent integers. But I wonder if anybody with us can shed some light on that. Jeremy, do you know?
Well, no, I don't. I only vaguely, but I think that's correct. I think something like that. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thanks for bringing it up. I've noted that down for my because I still haven't published my paper yet, and I've got a bit of work to do. So there's something I'll factor in. So thanks for bringing that up. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. Anyone else? Nigel.
You pointed out in the table where you basically have the timeline of people's births and deaths, and you pointed out that Methuselah seems to die in the year of the flood, which does seem to be a very striking coincidence, and does seem to suggest a reality to the story. The other interesting thing that struck me was that after Adam dies, the next person to go is actually Enoch. So he's a long way down the list. You've got lots of other people being born, but actually the next person to go after Adam is Enoch, which suggests an interesting comparison. And Adam sins and he dies, and the next person to go is Enoch, who walks with God and is taken. It was just it's not a very profound point, but I just think it's a very interesting aspect of that particular table.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yes, there it is. Enoch next.
And you're thinking, if you're living through those times, Adam is, the death of Adam must have been very significant. And actually, out of all those, and then to have Enoch just disappear is, quite a profound lesson.
Yeah. Oh, I never thought about that. That's quite interesting. That thanks for sharing. Makes you wonder if it's like almost God's sort of way of saying, oh, people, he's not giving up hope on me. So some people are, when they do honor him, and that's really interesting.
Two ways to live right there in the beginning of the genealogy here.
Yeah.
Alicia.
Thanks for talking us through this, both of you. It's really helpful to see all the kind of investigating of the different possibilities and what they need to prove and how. And I can't really speak to the kind of number analysis part, so I was glad to learn about that. But I'm thinking about if we imagine that this is really the case, and these people lived in nearly 1,000 years, and then that sort of went down. I guess one aspect we'd have to kind of take account of is I guess fertility, right? Because we're just seeing, the line here. We're just seeing, they had this son and then they had other sons and daughters. And I wonder, someone might need to apply some population statistics expertise here of some kind, because how many children are they having? If Noah's able to have 3 sons at the age of 500, how many sons has he had before? If not, why did he wait? He has another almost as long again afterwards. I'm sort of imagining what it would be like to have people live that long. It's so different to how we imagine the world and human society. Related to that, I guess we would have to think about why are these people not mentioned in the rest of the story, if you see what I mean. There's no reason why they should be, I suppose, but one might imagine. So is it only kind of this line that has this great longevity? Is it everyone in the whole world? How many people are we imagining in the world at this point? I'm kind of iterating ideas about it, and I think I don't expect an answer particularly, but I just thought it was interesting to think about. Thanks.
Yeah.
Richard, did you want to, because you've read the genetic entropy, you did a bit of looking into this book, and because I think that covers the population genetics quite a lot of those ideas.
Yes. So yes, I mean, this book called Genetic Entropy, it's the book that Brendan gave me by a chap called, is it Sanford? So I think Robert Sanford, is it?
John Sanford.
John Sanford, yes. A remarkable book that the argument of it is about evolution and how recent discoveries in population genetics about the rate of mutations in humans makes it implausible that the human genome would be doing anything other than degrading generation by generation, given that we don't have, if we had hundreds of children each, there might be just about enough for natural selection to get rid of nearly all of them and just leave the ones who didn't have deleterious mutations. But given that people don't have hundreds, or it might be thousands, I can't remember, of children, we don't breed like rabbits, the deleterious ones will inevitably be accumulating at the expense of any possible beneficial ones, unless you have an extremely optimistic scenario of mutations having to be beneficial, which doesn't fit with the Darwinian paradigm. That's a whole separate discussion which we shouldn't get into. But I suppose a few points. Well, one is that it was in that book that I first saw this graph, this scatter plot. That's the obvious connection. I suppose the other point is that if people were living to 900 or so, they had enough time to have indeed potentially hundreds of descendants. or getting on that way. And that could then, yeah, that you could, I suppose, then argue that only a very select few of those descendants were actually maintaining very high genetic quality in their genomes. But I don't think I want to push that too far, because in a special creation view, the human genome was of very high quality at the start, and it's progressively degraded since. And Sanford's argument seems to show that it's very difficult for anything else to have happened. But I think we might become, yes, I think it's rather complicated to try and put these different arguments juxtaposed, unless somebody actually takes a particular view on this topic. So I'll stop speculating there, but maybe there's another iron sharpens iron discussion.
We're saying in
on
this
topic.
model that Noah is a genetic bottleneck, right? That's why you kind of started from him.
Yes, I think that is part of the argument, isn't it, Michael? Yes, because Noah and his wife so all of Noah's, by taking the story at face value, all of Noah's sons, they come on board the ark with their wives, of course, but Noah's grandchildren would have to be marrying cousins, just as in the literal reading, Adam's children had to marry siblings, and his grandchildren had to marry cousins, and for those who haven't read into this, the special creation view would point out that because if humans were created in a mature and high quality state, then incest is not a problem. It's not a bad thing at all, because the incest becomes a problem because of mutations which wouldn't have been there in the early generations. So again, there's a long way to explore these models. They have a depth to them which is not always acknowledged by skeptics, I think I'd want to say. I want to move to Matthew next. Matthew, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I just wondered, am I right in remembering that the line of Cain doesn't have any ages? So the line of Seth, which has these big long ages, and the line of Cain has no ages given. I just wondered if you have any comments on the significance of that, or whether that's come into your research.
Yep. Sorry, I've had a bit of an asthma. Yeah, so I think it's Genesis 4, I think it is. It lists the Cain, and it actually gets to another Lamech that's quite an evil Lamech who wanted to have 7 times, or like a lot of revenge. I think some people have accidentally sort of just thought they're the same Lamech, but it's looks like it's 2 different lines. Yeah, so I think, I guess the way I see it is that as soon as you start listing genealogies, if you list everyone, then you're going to have a massive book, because it just exponentially increases with the amount of people that you've got to add in. And so the line follows important people to get to Abraham. And so that comes through Seth and not through Cain. So there's some history of Cain which it does sort of, I guess, go into some of the different nations at the time before the flood, which again would have been wiped out. But I think it just points to that there was evil that was, it gets to Lamech, and then the story of Lamech talks about all the revenge and everything. It just shows that things are progressing badly. And then, of course, talks about Noah in chapter 6, I think, when the world's getting really evil. There's some other things about Nephilim and things like that, but things need to be kind of restarted. So I think it's my thinking is that the Genesis 4 thing, even though doesn't list the ages like it does through Noah to then Abraham, which is important, it's just to show, there's other people around, and cities and cultures are being built, but it's the world is getting worse, and that's why the flood was needed, to kind of give things a reset.
So you don't think there's anything going on that there's almost like 2 paradigmatic lines, isn't there? There's a line that looks towards God and a line that looks away from it. And the line that looks away from it isn't associated with life, at least not long life. There's almost something Eden-like about the line of Seth, and it's very pointedly not there in the other line. Is the way I've always thought about it. I've wondered about it.
So you wonder if the line of Cain lived a lot shorter lives, and that was
I think
reflection
it's
of
pointed that maybe it's pointed that it's not specified.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess because they don't actually list the ages, but it's an interesting idea. I mean, if that was the case, then that'd be pretty clear sign from God to kind of be like, this is the way you should live in this. But I guess it has to stay at a level of speculation because we don't actually have but it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Alicia has commented, can I just read your comment, Alicia? It would be quite a different argument if only Seth's line was living a long time.
It's all the same genetic pool, right? So if we're relying on this idea that there's a good genetics which is decaying over time, I think that we couldn't argue that it was only one line. But anyway, I'm interested in the thought experiments that are going on here, and what you have to work out in these different cases.
Yeah, yes. I think actually, that's a good point. It's to say that it was only the line is not consistent with the genetic bottleneck model for Noah. So yeah, I agree. That's a good point. Yeah. So probably would expect that it would be a similar lifespans for everyone up until holding the genetic bottleneck model.
Yeah. Peter has another comment.
Probably minority view, pre-millennial, and if there's this, as I think there is, but I don't know everything, 1,000 years, and people possibly living to 1,000 years, because in Isaiah mentioning that a child dying at 100 is considered young. So if one takes a pre-millennial viewpoint, then perhaps long ages come back before the final heaven and earth.
That's an interesting thought. Yes, there may be some significance more significance to those Revelation passages with echoes of Genesis than we have noticed.
I just saw a comment from Malcolm about the 12,600 years in the Masoretic text. I think that's an interesting one too. That you do get. This is all the total lifespans, inclusive of Moses, as you get 12,600 years between Adam to Moses, and so we do get 1,260 in some apocalyptic literature. So I've seen some people point to that and say, oh, well, it had to have been put together to say there's some significance for Moses. But I would say that it has both symbolic meaning and it was truly what happened. Because, again, at the end of the day, I think if factoring in God and who he is and the control that he has on, however much control, but certainly he's God, and he's, if he created everyone, he has at least some influence on, when people die. And so I think that the Bible doesn't actually, other than when you do add the ages up, you get in the Masoretic text 12,600 years for the total lifespan, cumulative lifespans up to Moses. That's some people I've seen have argued to say that means it must have been put together to not mean literal ages, but purely symbolic. But I'd say it's probably both. That this is God's hand at work in that he wanted people to live to that, just to add just another little bit of spice to say, by the way, Moses was pretty important. You can also check the ages if you really want. But it's not elaborated upon in the actual text itself. So I think at best, we can say, okay, it's interesting that the numbers there. I haven't looked into the comments you put in there with relation to some of the apocalyptic literature. Those are ideas I haven't explored, but no, that's interesting. Yeah.
Malcolm, Are you commenting that your last comment about the time of the Messiah's ministry is 1260 days, potentially the 3.5 or 3 and a bit years of?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm really a chronologist, a biblical chronologist, and so I think that the numbers are symbolic between Adam and Moses. They add up to 12,600. Based on my own work, I believe that is literally the days of the Messiah under the law of Moses. Yeah. The time of his ministry, he fulfills perfectly the Levitical law to give a tenth back. So his ministry is 10% of that. And so the numbers point the way to the Messiah. I think in my own study, I think I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know how all those numbers were generated. I think your idea of an exponential curve is plausible, but I'm not sure we'll ever fathom that mystery. But for me, they point to the Messiah.
Thank you. Yes.
And also that also equates to the Solomon's Temple as well. So there's a chronological significance between the foundation of the temple and its first destruction by Shishak in the Book of Kings. But
Right.
yes, those are my views.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Nigel.
Just two things. One, it's not a knockdown proof, but I've always felt that aesthetically the long ages of Genesis felt right. And instead of thinking them living a very long time, to me it seems we live a very short time. And our lives are over in no time at all. And before you know it, you're 17, you've had your kids, and time's passed. I just think it feels really nice that you could be basically an adolescent for a couple of 100 years, and then you get married, and then you have several families, and presumably you get better at parenting as you get along. You get several goes at it. It just seems to me 1,000 years feels like a much better life than 70 years. Right? Not a knockdown argument, but I do think it feels right. Can I just take you back to one thing you said earlier on? I haven't kept up to date with creationist writing for a long time, but it always used to be said it was to do with the water canopy, that the water canopy disappears with the flood, and therefore radiation comes in, and life expectancy goes down with the changed climatic conditions. Were you suggesting that's no longer held as a view among creationists?
Yeah, it tends to be from what I've looked at it, most of the groups who supporting the creation ideas are not just, I mean, for scientific reasons. They think there's quite a few issues with it. There's only so much we can speculate in the past using science, but also biblical reasons. As it did appeal to a lot of little passages in the Bible to say, oh, now we know what this means. Now we know what this means. But then there was some, when they looked at it further, like, oh, so there's actually, if you look up on creation.com, that's the ministry I'm part of, if you look up canopy theory, they've got some pretty long, detailed articles looking at the Bible and the science to say that, again, I guess the lesson is that they've kind of learned from it is that we hold tightly to what the Bible says, but very loosely to our models to interpret the gaps between what the Bible says. So generally speaking, it's, I think it's certainly reasonable to assume that if there was a global flood, that environment conditions, things would be very different. But to say that the whole climate system in itself, in terms of rain, is different, is pretty unlikely. So that's the general consensus at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any last comments? No, very well. I think that we'll thank Michael and I found it fascinating. I hope you have. I realised this was rather a technical evening compared to what we usually have, but I wanted us to share these ideas, yes, but while realising that there's space for various views among Bible believing Christians. But I'm impressed by what Michael's presented and these ideas, and thank you very much for the insightful comments, which have certainly enriched our thinking on this, and may even make their way into what Michael is writing, you never know, for his journal article. So thank you again. Thanks so much, Michael, for joining us so early in the morning over there in Brisbane. And thank you, everybody from other parts of the world as well, for joining us this evening. Next session will be in June, and Alan Cameron will be talking to us. I will send the email a few days before that, talking about the body in law and in health. That's my memory of it, but there's more information on our website at thinkfaith.net on what he's going to talk about, and that will be the 25th of June. Thank you very much. Have a good day or good night. And hope to see you again.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.